Okay, well, I'm going to start with a quick introduction. We have, over the last couple of weeks, have had the chance to hear from professional photographers and interior designers, an architect, and even a food stylist. But today I'm excited to introduce you guys to Rolf Nelson. Rolf has a background in graphic design, which is why we reached out to him. And Rolf and I actually go back, we studied together in college. But it sounds like over the past few years, Rolf has kind of shifted his focus into a more contemporary realm and maybe even a more futuristic realm into something called UX design. And so I'm excited for you guys to hear what that's all about today as well. But maybe as a start, Rolf, you can take us back to kind of where you got your start in this creative world. What led you to pursue graphic design to begin with? And then how did you get to where you are now from that exploration of graphic design?
Yeah, I originally actually was in school for mechanical engineering, and I was totally math and science based all through high school. Just truly a big nerd, and nothing really has changed on that front. But I took my first drawing class in college, and I've always been kind of quirky and ended up submitting a t-shirt design to this company called Threadless. And when it got printed, I saw the power of design, how many people were responding to it and what it meant to them, how many people were saying it's their favorite shirt. And over the past 15 years now, that shirt is one of their all-time top sellers and is just consistently coming up in places. It was recently on that TV show The Flash. One of the characters
Huh,
wore it, and
no
like
way. Wow.
just totally bizarre stuff like that. It doesn't die. I've seen it on a bathroom stall. Somebody wrote it on a bathroom stall one time.
Yeah, that's really cool that it's had that longevity. And so that led to maybe pursuing a different degree path in college.
Yeah, it was kind of a perfect storm, seeing the power of design, taking that first drawing class and really just falling in love with the industry and realizing that there was a career path there and not just being artsy fartsy. You could actually turn it into things that are useful or entertaining or whatever and make a big impact in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So you made the switch to graphic design from engineering, and talk to me about some of the types of things that you learned in college or even since college. What graphic design is kind of a broad term, I think, and I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means. So what exactly are the types of things you do as a graphic designer?
Anything and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, even pulling back onto my engineering background, I've been able to take some of that, knowledge and apply it to motion graphics. Understanding physics is a huge part of motion graphics and making them feel solid and feel natural, humanistic in a way, and not super mechanical, and, it's really uncomfortable when things don't move with a natural feel to them. So understanding physics and friction and all of that stuff played into that, and I did a lot of motion work when I was working at Fossil. So I worked there for 3 years. I did a lot of motion work. I did some production, like stage and live production stuff when I was freelancing for a bit.
Can you break down what some of that means? So when you talk about motion work, what is motion work?
Yeah, motion design is taking essentially solid pieces of design, what could be considered maybe a poster, and giving it life through means that'll be consumed on a digital screen. So every piece of kinetic or moving typography, words and phrases and stuff like that you see while you're scrolling through Instagram and Facebook, it is absolutely just everywhere now. And the longer, we're reliant on our tech, the more you're going to see of it. In the past, it would have been posters, but now everything has life and needs to move.
So one kind of maybe obvious large scale example of this is, going to Times Square in New York 10 years ago, you would have seen a bunch of large banners and billboards on the sides of buildings. Now, when you walk through Times Square, it's all video screens. Is that the type of work you're talking about?
Yeah, and actually, New York is a great example. I was able to do this project for Macy's in Herald Square, so their flagship store. and the entire basement was geared towards a younger generation. And it being a very popular tourist area, there were some other things that needed to be taken into consideration as far as language and stuff goes. But the familiarity with Instagram and using social media and images, we created a 25-foot by 5-foot interactive touch wall. It's gigantic, and it was this art piece when people weren't interacting with it, but when they were interacting with it, swiping their fingers across and moving these giant tiles of images using a hashtag, I think Macy's Love, people just came up and would naturally start interacting with it like it was a giant version of their phones.
Yeah.
But it's a huge, huge experience, which is totally different than just walking past a wall of posters, right?
It seems like a lot of that is more conceptual, that your work, at least from college until now, has moved into a more conceptual realm, coming up with ideas rather than, things like typeset. And
Yeah, I've gone through, from the production side of actually producing the stuff to the concept side is really where my strength is. And those are still both grouped into graphic design. Right. So if you're just really good at making stuff, you can be a designer. But if you have really great concepts and can work with insanely talented photographers and developers and designers, you can also be a designer. Right. So
Yeah.
there's two sides of that coin, really.
Well, and I think to be on the concept side, you still have to be able to translate ideas that are in your head and get other people on the same page visually with what you're imagining in your head. So some of your background in art and design can still help with that, I imagine.
Definitely. Yeah. Storyboards, sketches, thumbnails, that I will put stuff down on paper or make really quick outlines, or we call them wireframes in the UX world, just to let somebody understand what it is that I'm talking about or how I'm thinking about solving the problem. And generally I need a check mark, a thumbs up, an approval before we put the amount of effort in to actually produce the thing. But often, that's enough of an idea to get them saying, okay, I can sort of see where you're going, even though they may not be as visual or fully understand the concept. When you can show them those initial building blocks, that's usually the first step.
how many of those do you usually go into that first meeting with? I mean, are you talking like 3 concepts and letting them kind of steer you?
It depends on how close I've been working with them, how hand in hand we've been working on it together. Because if they see some of the work, or if I'm working with some of the client side designers, they tend to come along a bit easier because it's their input constantly. And I try to do that. I try to allow clients to provide input early and often. But if it's just a one-off pitch, yeah, a couple of polished concepts that allow them to understand where we're going or what we're coming at it from, and provide them the strategic values. What they'll want to know is return on investment. So how much is this thing going to cost to make, and how much am I expected to get back on it? But that's more on the business side. But really just showing them that concept, even if it's just a prototype, it's not actually working, it's just kind of faked for the moment. That'll get the sign off and allow us to have the resources we need to actually produce the final product. I would say my Spence Diamonds project actually has quite a bit of that. It's literally just squares to showcase what might be possible.
Great.
Could we kind of make a clarification on what UX is?
Well, that's a good point. I don't know that we actually defined what
it.
UX design means.
Yeah, so user experience design is essentially a combination of research and design. And what we strive to do is both map out what existing users are having to do to get from point A to point B, and then create a game plan using all of this data. Like, we go and sit with people who are using software or trying to do their daily jobs using apps or websites, and we document all of that. And then we start to see trends and patterns in what they're doing, where their pain is. And so we focus our design efforts on alleviating pain and accomplishing the tasks that they're actually trying to accomplish by creating a better piece of software. So that's in a nutshell what user experience is.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk us through one of these projects, maybe Spence Diamonds or another one of these projects, and talk us through from start to finish, what does a project like this look like?
Yeah, so it does depend on, if I'm working for an agency or working with a group versus working by myself. Generally, working with a group, there will be a business development team who is going out and pitching and selling ideas, or at least getting further conversations with companies that are either looking or have put out an RFP, which is a request for proposal, in which we would come back and say, hey, here's what we're proposing, what we might be able to do for a solution, here's about how much it'll cost, and then they'll make a decision on who they're going to go with. The company I'm working for right now, Project 202, doesn't really do those, or at least we really don't like to. So that's how we bill. We don't bill by project. We just bill by how much you use us, essentially. And so when projects come up, our reputation generally gets us entrenched in these companies, at big Fortune 500 companies, FedEx, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, the Capital One, you name it. We're in with a lot of these groups and helping them solve, Southwest Airlines, helping them solve some of the most complex problems that often they aren't consumer facing. There are a lot of internal, but we're solving the problems of why you end up on hold for like an hour when you call a phone company.
Well, let me take a step back, because one thing, I know that UX is kind of your focus and it's what you do now, but I think it's maybe good for the guys to hear a little bit, because a lot of what's been repeated throughout some of these other industries that they've heard from is this idea of a brand. And I think we can talk about that through the lens of UX, but I think just through the lens of graphic design as well, this idea of how a brand is defined and what a brand is, and how you go about trying to either define that brand if it's a new company, or how you try to fit something to a brand for something that's more established.
Yeah, that is half of I don't know, even maybe more than half of the effort as a designer to match an existing brand, or if you are in on the ground floor creating a brand from nothing, from just the dust. Like there is so much to it that makes it beyond just a logo, and that's a huge point of emphasis that I have communicated over and over to different clients that say, I just want a logo, that's it. And I'm like, sure, yeah, I can build you one,
Right.
but let's talk about long-term strategy, where you're going to use it, so I can build you the best in those scenarios that'll work for those scenarios, or build you the options that'll work for those scenarios into your brand. But then let's also talk about, what kind of energy you want it to have, who it is you're talking to, what the demographic is. And lately I've been using a bit more of psychographic, which is not necessarily just the gender and age and location of the person, but it's the mindset of the person that the brand is trying to talk to. So when you're creating a brand, being cognizant of those things, and not just the logo, but all of the future collateral, the ads, the placements that you have, from billboards to Instagram ads, and understanding the mindset of the people that will be consuming that, and creating the most dynamic, relevant content to go along with the brand, says, hey, we're not just this faceless corporation. We understand that there are people out there, they're looking at our stuff, and we want to be able to provide value to you. And that's a lot of the effort that goes into creating a brand, outside of just that mark that we all see and resonate with.
Right. But even just that mark, I think, takes a lot of thought. As simple as some logos may appear, they don't just appear out of nowhere. And I think they have some deeper meaning behind them and behind some of the design decisions that you've made. I wonder if we look at some of the logos that you've created, are there any in particular that you might be able to speak to, some specific design decisions that went into the development of some of these?
One of my all-time favorite things to do, and I know that I'm not the prototypical designer in this sense, but one of my very, very favorite things to do in a logo is to kind of make a hidden message. And it's a kind of a game for myself to not just say, hey, here's a mark and it can mean the things that you want to make it mean, but let's actually put some stuff into it. So we could talk about any of them, really. There's one for Frontier Creations, for instance. This is actually my dad's parent company. So my father is a puppeteer and has been for 40 years.
That's awesome.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, he's responsible for the work with McGruff in the late 80s, early 90s.
That's amazing. I don't know that our students will know who McGruff is, but I think that's awesome.
The crime dog.
Yeah. So yeah, his company, they still make puppets. They do some other stuff, but a lot of school educational stuff, as well as safety, crime prevention, and church programming. So vacation Bible schools and stuff like that. But for the mark itself, they needed a corporate entity because the company that sells puppets is called Puppets Inc. They have their own branch. They do what they do. And that is pretty much, that's kind of the main company under the umbrella. And so with this mark, I wanted to help them portray, hey, we're going to new places, new kind of uncharted territories, like a new frontier. But also, like, if you turn that mark a little bit, just slightly, it looks like a little smiley face. And that's really the view of a puppet. And so I kind of just hid that in there, but it's really like a little rocket ship, like an homage to a rocket ship. And it's very, very simple mark because the lettering, the words needed to come out first. But yeah, that just extra little hidden meaning to it. It's kind of a fun game that I really enjoy playing.
That's great. Yeah, you have a lot of those great, maybe double or hidden meanings in some of these logos. How much thought, because we're trying to get our guys to think about the types of shapes or the types of colors or, lines, these very basic visual elements, and how very subtle adjustments or decisions regarding those kinds of things might influence a certain feeling or energy, as you put it, from a logo or some bigger design work. Do you have maybe one or two examples of where you've had some very intentional thought regarding some of those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, all the way through. So leaning back onto like some of the lessons that are, I guess, the initial basics of design. And when you talk about like color theory and grouping theory, they're just how things fit together, and the colors that you use impact the way that we intrinsically just feel about things. So generally, a lot of tech companies are using cooler colors like blue. So think Twitter, Facebook, Zoom, PayPal. Blue is like welcoming, inviting, and they give people this kind of ease and comfort. And then red and orange tend to be a bit more intense. In fact, red online tends to signify a lot of bad things you don't want to happen. So if a company isn't known for being online and being hyper tech driven, they'll tend to go with a warmer color, especially like restaurants. So Chili's, Chipotle, Applebee's, you name it. The food is red, orange, browns. They're appetizing. They're also warm and inviting in a more human sense, not like the calming effect that a blue might give on a backlit screen. So very intentional choices as far as color goes throughout any of the projects that I take, but also like they can be used as like homages to reference something without having a literal translation one-to-one of what it's supposed to represent. So for instance, MedAv is another logo that I had done. It's for an improv comedy troupe that one of my best friends is in down in Austin. And if you're familiar with old comedy, Steve Martin, the Arrow headband, but the arrow itself is actually taken from a Monopoly board as the pass go arrow, and Mediterranean Avenue is the first location on a Monopoly board. So it's like the cheapest location.
And purple.
Uh-huh. Exactly. So there's quite a few little, homages and pastiche, I guess you might call it, to what it is referencing without it being just blatantly a ripoff. And you have to do that to create original content now because, nothing is truly original.
Everything is ripped off from something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
So even something like tilting that arrow upward, right? Or, having all lowercase. I mean, are these, the offset of the red and the arrow with the purple outline help a student who's just being introduced to the intentionality of this kind of stuff? Walk us through all of the kind of hidden meanings and underlying messages there.
Yeah, so lowercase letters across the board, while it's not necessarily recognized as being the most legible, lowercase is friendly. So you'll notice a lot of kids brands and young entertainment sort of kids shows and stores they're all going to be lowercase. Some have, initial caps and stuff like that, but it's a way to kind of create this more friendly brand. When a bunch of the food brands started rebranding, they all went lowercase because they felt like they were beating you over the head with their big, bold caps. Now, granted, there was quite a bit of backlash to some of that, but that was the intent, was to create this friendlier brand. The baselines on this are uneven. So the E is elevated a little bit, the V is elevated a little bit. So they're just kind of playing a little bit, the letters themselves, rather than just being locked to a very solid baseline. And that kind of indicates, and what the story I was attempting to tell with it is the improvisational motives behind the group. You kind of never know where their next step is going to be. And being off kilter like that, while playful, is also part of the charm of improv and why you would go to see it. Stylistically, the offset print, like it's lacking proper registration, also has to do with that, telling that improv story. It's not set in stone, and part of the charm of like having colors offset and missing that registration back in the day due to the old printing processes created some really unique bleeds and overflows in color that we have to be intentional to do today. It's way harder to accidentally do that, but it has to do with playing on design process and actually bringing that in to tell the story of improvisation.
That's great.
Great. One question I had for you, Rolf, especially since you've made this move into not move. It sounds like from the very beginning, even at Fossil, you were doing UX design, but graphic design is a big umbrella, first of all, and you kind of went in the direction of more digital UX kind of design. I would say, although I didn't necessarily pursue a full-time career in graphic design, I still do some. And so I made more of a move toward the print side of design. As someone who's done both, I'm curious, do you have maybe a different approach or a different thought process when it comes to doing more digital and UX type of work than you would on a print side?
Yeah, and I think I drive my coworkers crazy because I want to do a lot of stuff off of the computer. I draw a lot. I go to the whiteboard. I'll doodle on just endless Post-its. We use them to track data and understand what people are interacting and actually doing with the software. But I'll use it to get ideas down, and sometimes just to make a stupid doodle because I had an idea. But I do think a lot in interactions when I'm doing print design. I want people to interact with the print piece. And then when I'm doing digital, I want it to work as a standalone poster print piece, but give it that kinetic feel. How can I surprise them when they interact with something, or how can I make it feel like they're part of a series? So if I'm creating a website, each page will be kind of like part of a series that helps tell the bigger story of what the brand is, or if it's a play, or if it's a coffee shop or whatever, a menu item. How am I telling the bigger story piece by piece in much smaller chunks, page by page, rather than just trying to say, hey, we're a restaurant, here's our website.
Okay. It's interesting, as you're talking, I'm kind of making this realization that, and you even said yourself, you think of it almost as a printed piece, just with a little bit of a bonus because it can move. So it sounds like UX design is more in line with print design than it is with, say, filmmaking or even video advertising. It's not like you're making a commercial. You're really designing a print piece. It's just a print piece that's meant to be displayed digitally. Is that accurate?
Well, that would be in the experiential area. So like when I am doing stuff in physical space, yeah, I would consider that to be true, especially because there is signage, right? So generally there will be print signage accompanying digital signage to let them know, hey, interact with this, or this way to wherever you're trying to get to. I did some signage at some amusement parks, Cedar Fair, so Cedar Point, Kings Island, Knott's Berry Farm, and we did the maps. Also at Nebraska Furniture Mart, a big shop up in the Colony, I did the maps. So they're touchscreen maps, but people used to use print maps all the time, and so these maps the one plus that digital gives them is like, okay, you're at this location. A print map can't tell you that. So when you have multiple kiosks around, you say, you're at this location, you're going to need to turn left from here, facing the way that you're facing. You're going to want to turn left and then go, it's about a 2-minute walk, and there's a 45-minute wait at that ride. So manage your expectations, all that stuff that a print map can't do. So we take the basics and then apply stuff on top of it. But for UX, really that process is user experience. So we take what users are doing today, how they're interacting with, even if it was a physical space, but how they're interacting with their current software and what their actual needs are. So we try to understand really what's their pain. Am I using 12 different pieces of software to try to do one task? And how can we consolidate that and make one piece of software accomplish the task that they're doing? So the UX and experiential are slightly different. They're on the same spectrum for sure, but yeah, it's it gets complicated when you get into all the subgenres of what you can do with design.
And it sounds like it can get very technical, and outside of maybe someone who is a more artistic type might get out of their comfort realm. So I imagine you probably have a lot of collaboration, or you have coworkers who do a lot of collaboration between someone who's more artistic and someone who's more technical on the programming and software side of things.
Yeah, within the field of UX, it is unbelievable what backgrounds people have. There's a lot of people coming from ethnographic studies, so like sociology and anthropology coming into UX. There are people with architecture, product, engineering, like physical sculpture and stuff like that, with those backgrounds coming in because they understand how to build actual architecture. And so sites like websites have architecture. And so they're doing information architecture, which is an aspect of UX. Visual design is also an aspect. Generally, people refer to it as UI or user interface. And this comes down to like icon creation, but there's also interaction design. So when somebody clicks on one of those icons, what happens? How does it feel? And all of those things kind of combine into this just another crazy net of design to create an experience. At the end of the day, it has to be developed. Is some of that stuff that we design to make move pretty and stuff like that, is it realistic? Can it be developed? Sometimes no. But it's never a one-person team in UX. Whereas a designer can sit down and make a poster.
That's great.
I mean, that's not excluding the client and their opinions as well. I'm thinking all of the artists in each industry that we've talked to have had moments where they were so proud of an idea. I mean, I was listening to you walk through some of your designs for some simple logos that have a lot of meaning behind them and content.
Logos that look simple, not
that's
necessarily
right.
that they're simple to make.
Absolutely. In fact, there's a saying in soccer that soccer is a simple game that's difficult to play simply, right? The best players are the simplest players. So I have great respect for minimalism and simplicity. I use that with reverence. But have you had an idea where, man, it's just loaded with content and, your sweat and equity, and somebody says, yeah, no?
Most definitely. Yeah, it happens a lot. And it's not just the client, but again, like working with developers or whoever else may need to be involved in producing a finished product that just say, hey, I can't do this in the amount of time, I can't do it in the budget, or I just simply don't like that. In which case, subjective stuff, I can generally talk through and understand what it is about the design that isn't resonating with them and adjust from there, or talk them into it, depending on what it is that they're trying to actually accomplish. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to a communication game. If you're not communicating with your teammates or with the stakeholders, your client, or whomever else may be touching or looking at this thing, if you're not communicating with them properly, you can expect to get a lot more of the negative responses. The more you communicate, the better and more invested people tend to be. And so they see it as their own, even though they didn't produce it, something they can be proud of. So yeah, but I have had a bit of heartburn. Sometimes my favorite design didn't get chosen, or out of 3 we presented, they loved one, and I was like, oh, That's the worst
The
one.
worst one.
But that's kind of part of it. I've disassociated my personal taste and my personal thought from the work that I do, because really at the end of the day, I'm communicating for somebody else.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because I think it's important for our guys to hear that it's about that communication. I think one of the things that we're going to ask them to do in the last week, when they are emulating your job in a lot of ways, is that idea that they need to be able to communicate their ideas. So it's not just about the end result and boom, I got it, there it is, right? But do you have the language? Because you're selling, I mean, you're being a salesman essentially for ideas that, somebody else might know the restaurant business, but they don't know how to sell that through an image.
Yeah, one of the most exciting and I guess gratifying things is when you do sell an idea, or when you just produce the idea that you were hired to do in the first place, and you find your client using the same language
Mm.
that you have because they're proud of it and they go forth. So in UX, we create personas, and they're essentially imaginary people, imaginary users of the product that fit into those trends and what they're trying to do on the daily. And what happens is the companies use those personas, they use these imaginary people to help explain why they need features in their software internally. And so it's just really gratifying, because you'll hear them say, no, Greg, this guy Greg, he ships things constantly. He needs this function in our software because his focus is to get things out the door. And they talk to each other about Greg, who doesn't actually exist, but it's exciting because they get it, and they start to prioritize what is the most important aspect. Same thing with the logo. Like they'll talk about, oh yeah, no, it has to be this way. I love it this way, and this is why, just because they can tell the story then.
Right now I'm typing that that's part of their final project now, is that they're going to have to use, not only sell Mr. Williams and Mr. Howard on their idea by using language and ideas from the class, but they're going to have to use personas to illustrate why they made those choices. I love that.
Yeah, I think it's great. So one thing that David was alluding to is that in our final week of class, our guys will be grouped up into teams, and they'll have one member in each team representing the different industries that they've heard from. So each group will have an architect and an interior designer and a food stylist, and each group will now have a graphic designer, UX designer, and they will be tasked with inventing a new restaurant, and they'll have to create the entire restaurant experience. And so one thing that I'm curious to hear from you, Rolf, is from the UX perspective, what are some interesting things that these guys might think about doing in terms of developing a restaurant UX experience?
Yeah, so I don't know if you remember my senior thesis or were able to see that. I think you were
No, I didn't
gone.
see it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually, in school, I had actually developed a restaurant theater combo. So I did exactly that stuff, like the inside outside of the theater, and the concept was these smaller pods that like families or groups of friends could go and rent out and see a video with no wait staff. Like the food service came up from the middle of the tables, you ordered on a touch screen, and all of that stuff. While it wasn't viable at the time and would be insanely expensive to create, you saw the proliferation of all of these restaurant theaters start popping up. People are paying more and more for premium theater experiences. The being able to go with just your family right
Yeah, I
now
was about to
Yeah,
say,
these
is
you were way ahead of your
it's
time.
I apparently was. um but those sort of things, like all of that consideration into one project, I think it's a great project. Sorry, I want to make sure I answer the question that you asked.
Yeah.
I just got excited about the prompt.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. If you were guiding these guys and overseeing them, what might you, what are some good questions you would offer them so that, boy, that then their ideas could really mature and come to fruition?
I would first and foremost really ask them to consider about the time that we're in right now,
yeah.
to be not only more globally conscious, but socially conscious and all of that. And as a designer and as a creative, what is your responsibility in furthering humanity, as it were, and creating experiences that do the best for everyone? Because accessibility is just a huge effort in design. globally. And if we're not designing for, those who can't see color or have a visual impairment or have a hearing impairment or have a mobility issue, when we're designing for them, we're actually doing a greater good for everyone. And I say that because there's one example that just I always go back to, and it's curb cuts, those corners at intersections that are kind of bumpy and everyone utilizes, bikes, skateboards, you name it. That was it overcame a huge challenge in which people in the 60s were actually using angle grinders and cutting curbs in Berkeley because they couldn't get their wheelchairs on and off of the curb. But now everybody knows that's the intersection, that's a safe place to cross. I can roll my cart across it. It benefits everybody, but it was initially to solve a problem for those who do not. So that's definitely the first thing I would challenge them with is what are they doing to do the most good for all?
That's awesome.
That's great because one of our tenets is being socially just. So I think that's a good reminder.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe a good way to end. Mr. Williams, do you have any other questions?
This has been fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you, Rolf. We really appreciate your time.
Definitely. Yeah. Happy to help wherever I can.
Thanks, Rolf.
Thank you.